I want to be clear that I did not go looking for any of this. The posting came through the civilian contractor board the same way every posting did: a facility identifier, a clearance tier, a list of systems requiring maintenance, and a daily rate that was, all things considered, acceptable. The facility identifier was Scarath 7. I didn't look it up because I had worked in worse places and the systems list was ordinary enough: drain manifolds, water pressure regulators, climate seal gaskets along the lower corridors, and something listed as Drevac pen seal inspection recurring. I knew what Drevac were. Most people did. I had a daughter at home, a mortgage, and a maintenance certification that covered alien habitat environmental systems, and the daily rate was acceptable. So I signed the posting and showed up on a Monday morning with my tool bag and my thermos and a copy of my clearance paperwork. The facility was a detention complex. That word, complex, doing a lot of heavy lifting for what was essentially a very large hole in a rocky plateau, extended downward by about 9 levels and outward by corridors that went as far as I ever needed to go and then stopped. The surface buildings were the administrative face of it: clean lines, a visitor checkpoint, a commissary, an infirmary. Below the second level, facilities like this one tend to reveal what they actually are, which is infrastructure that has been in operation for a long time and maintained according to budget cycles rather than need. I am familiar with this infrastructure type. My entire working life has been inside it. Harrow Block was the deepest. Level 9, the eastern extension, the end of the corridor. The intake officer gave me a map and a key card and a brief instructional about the Drevac sector that amounted to, "Don't." I said I understood. She said she was serious. I said I was too. She handed me the key card and gave me the look that facility intake officers give civilian contractors when they are not certain that the contractor has fully grasped the nature of the work environment. I have received that look at approximately 40% of the facilities I have worked in. I thanked her and went to find the service elevator. The warden was Overseer Seth Dallera. She ran the facility on behalf of a multi-jurisdictional corrections authority that I will not name here because I still have outstanding invoices with them, and I prefer not to complicate that situation. She was the kind of administrator who had probably been effective at something, somewhere in her career, and had allowed that past effectiveness to become a kind of ambient credential, a glow she carried around that she believed was still warm. I have met her type in every institution I have ever contracted for. They are identifiable by the way they receive information, with the expression of someone who has already filed what you are about to say before you finish saying it, not because they are listening well, but because they have stopped listening at all and replaced it with a general sense of competence. She greeted me the way you greet a piece of maintenance equipment, with mild relief that it had arrived and zero interest in anything further. She told her deputy, a younger officer named Veth Sarin who had the nervous efficient quality of someone perpetually running slightly late, to make sure I was logged in all the right places. Then she turned back to her desk and I ceased to exist for her. This was professionally ideal. The maintenance contractors who have the most difficult time in institutional settings are the ones who need to be acknowledged. I have never needed to be acknowledged. I need access panels, accurate system schematics, and a working service elevator. Veth Sarin was more thorough. He walked me down to Harrow Block himself, which I later understood was unusual. The standard procedure was to have a guard escort maintenance personnel, not a deputy warden. But he wanted to show me the specific gasket failure points himself, because there had been 3 drain backup events in the prior cycle, and at least 2 of them had been in the Drevac sector, and the animals did not behave well when their environment was disrupted. He said this last part looking straight ahead down the corridor, not at me. I noted the phrasing, did not behave well. He said it the way you say it about something you do not want to be more specific about. I have learned over 22 years to translate that phrasing. It means the specifics are something the institution prefers not to document, but that the person in front of you has personally witnessed, and is alerting you to, via indirection, as a professional courtesy. I thanked him for the courtesy. The Drevac pen was behind a reinforced pressure door at the far end of the sector, but the pen itself was not a cell in any conventional sense. It was a long, low-ceilinged space that ran the full width of the corridor, with a sealed grate floor over a drainage channel, and access panels along one wall that allowed entry to the maintenance crawlspace beneath. The animals used the pen as a base of operations rather than a containment cell. The inner door to the facility's lower exercise passage was open most of the day, and they moved freely between the pen and the passage and back. They were there to deter escape attempts. The facility had not had an escape attempt in 11 years, which was either a testament to the Drevac or to the drainage and climate infrastructure, or both. I was there for the second thing. There were 7 of them. I had seen pictures, the way you see pictures of anything. The pictures do not help. The Drevac are wolf-shaped in the way that a freight container is box-shaped. The category is correct, but the scale and the material and the implication are all wrong. The smallest one, which turned out to be the youngest, came up to my sternum. The largest, the Alpha, the old one I would later call Save, came up to my shoulder at the spine ridge, and when he raised his head his eyes were level with my own. They were gray-black, all of them, with coats that looked like wet slate in the corridor lighting, and along their spines ran a row of keratinous ridges that lay flat when they were calm and raised when they were not. Their eyes were amber. They glowed faintly, which was not bioluminescence but a reflective membrane, the same principle as a cat's eye in a flashlight beam. I had looked that up in advance, because the pictures suggested something supernatural, and I preferred to know the biological fact. The biological fact was no more comforting than the supernatural explanation, but it was at least accurate. Vethsaran pointed out the access panel seams from the corridor side of the pressure door, talking quickly, keeping his clipboard between himself and the grate. The Drevac watched from the exercise passage entry. The Alpha Save, though I hadn't named him yet, stood at the front of the group and watched me specifically. Not in an alarmed way, not in an anticipatory way exactly. More the way a senior tradesperson watches a new arrival on a job site, assessing competence, reserving judgment, prepared to revise the assessment in either direction depending on what happened next. I nodded at the access panels and told Vethsaran I understood the layout. He said good, and that I should submit my access requests through the duty officer, and that under no circumstances was I to enter the pen space itself. I said I understood. He left. I stood at the pressure door for a moment longer, looking at the access panel seams, and the Alpha stood at the exercise passage entry looking at me. Then I opened my tool bag and got to work. The access panels were on the corridor side, which meant I could do the drain manifold inspection from outside the pen. This was fine. I did not need to enter the pen. I was there for the pipes. The first drain backup was in the secondary line beneath the pen floor, a partial seal failure where the gasket material had degraded in what appeared to be a chemical interaction with the mineral content of the facility's cleaning solution. Someone had been using the wrong product on the grate surfaces. I noted this in my inspection report and replaced the gasket and moved to the pressure regulators. The secondary line repair took about an hour and 15 minutes. When I finished and stood up and secured the access panel, the Alpha was standing directly on the other side of the pressure door's grate, watching me from about 3 feet away. His ridged spine was flat. His tail was relaxed. He was simply there, watching. I said, "All right, then." He did not respond to this, which was appropriate. I picked up my tool bag and moved to the next station. The second time I came down to Harrow Block, 2 days later, he was at the grate when I arrived. Not in a tense posture, not the posture of an animal alerting to an intruder. He was lying down with his head up, the way a dog lies near a door when it has been waiting, and he raised his head when I came down the corridor and watched me approach with an attention that was neither aggressive nor indifferent. I set down my tool bag, opened the access panel for the climate seal inspection and worked. He watched. After about 40 minutes, he lay down on the grate directly above the access point I was working in, which meant his considerable weight was pressing down on the grate in a way that made a very specific metallic sound every time he shifted. And the other 6 had drifted in from the exercise passage and were distributed around the pen in the way animals distribute themselves when they are not doing anything in particular, but have collectively decided that the vicinity of a specific thing is where they want to be. I finished the climate seal inspection, noted 2 gaskets that would need replacement in the next service cycle, and packed up. When I stood, the Alpha raised his head. I said, "See you Thursday," and left. I know how this sounds. What I want to be clear about is that I was not doing anything special. I was doing maintenance. I was being quiet, which is not a strategy. It is simply how I work. I was not attempting to establish rapport with apex predators. I was keeping my head down in a difficult workspace, which is what you do when you are a 44-year-old widower with a daughter in secondary school and a contract that pays an acceptable daily rate. The animals in the pen were not my responsibility. The pipes were my responsibility. But on Thursday, when I came back to replace the 2 gaskets I had noted, the Alpha was at the grate, and when I opened the access panel and settled in to work, he pushed his nose through one of the grate gaps and sniffed at the top of my head. I didn't move. The grate gap was not large enough for anything else to fit through, not a paw, not a jaw, so there was nothing to be alarmed about, and I was not alarmed. I was, if I am honest, mildly curious about what conclusion he was drawing. After a moment, he withdrew his nose and lay back down. I reached into the side pocket of my tool bag and found the thermal flask I'd brought for the climate maintenance work. The facility's water temperature ran warm, and the seals in that sector required a cold fluid flush to seat properly. I had mixed cold tap water with the facility's mineral flush solution at the correct ratio. I poured a small amount of the cold water into my spare cup, slid it through the gap at the base of the access panel frame, and set it down on the grate surface inside the pen boundary. It was gone in about 6 seconds. The cup came back through the gap empty, resting on its side. I want to be clear, the cold water was for the seals. There was extra. It seemed wasteful to pour it out. Over the following 3 weeks, I came to understand the facility's maintenance schedule well enough to know which systems could be serviced in the upper levels and which required work in Harrow Block. The drain manifold was a recurring item. The wrong cleaning solution problem was facility-wide, not isolated, and every replacement gasket I put in was going to fail again unless someone changed their chemical protocol, which I noted in every inspection report and which, based on the evidence, no one was reading. The climate seals were a quarterly item. The pen's ventilation scrubber filters needed replacement on a 6-week cycle that someone had been allowing to extend to 10. I began running on the 6-week cycle. The animal's breathing improved. I know this because the low exhalation through the grate gap became even and quiet rather than the slightly labored sound it had been on my first visits. The youngest, the female with 3 small scars on her left shoulder, whom I had privately started calling 3, had been making a sound during rest that I can only describe as a micro-rattle, a small vibration in the upper respiratory tract that probably had a clinical name but that I had cataloged as not right, and that disappeared within 2 weeks of the filters going back to the correct cycle. I mentioned the ventilation cycle in my second monthly report. No response. I mentioned the chemical cleaning solution in my third monthly report. No response. I did not take this personally. I am not a person who takes administrative silence personally. I have been doing maintenance work for 22 years, and administrative silence is simply the medium through which maintenance personnel communicate with facilities management in most of the institutions I have worked in. The important thing is that the work gets done. The work was getting done. On my 31st day of the contract, the Alpha got out. Not out of the facility, out of the pen. through a great gap that had been present since my first day, and that I had noted in 3 separate inspection reports. The gap was at the base of the outer frame, where the grate met the corridor wall, approximately 14 inches wide, 8 inches high, the result of a weld failure that had been occurring gradually over what looked like several months. Large enough, apparently, for a determined animal of sufficiently flexible build to work through at low speed. He simply walked through it, at the end of my morning shift, while I was packing up my tool bag in the corridor. One moment he was behind the pressure door, the next moment he was not. He walked to where I was crouching over my tool bag and sat down. I finished packing up my tool bag. He was very close enough that I was aware of his breath on the side of my face and the specific weight of his attention, which is not metaphorical. There is a physical quality to the attention of an apex predator at close range that has to do with their absolute stillness and the directedness of their regard. He was not fidgeting. He was not telegraphing anything in particular. He was simply there in the same space, in the same stillness, and his breath was warm and had the iron mineral quality that large carnivores have, and that is, if you know what you are smelling, not alarming. I stood up, he stood up. I said, "You're going to get me in trouble." He walked beside me to the corridor junction. At the junction, where I turned right toward the service elevator, he stopped. He watched me go. When I looked back from the elevator, he was still at the junction. When the elevator closed, the last thing I saw was the amber of his eyes in the corridor light. I wrote up the great gap as an urgent repair item in my afternoon report and had it sealed the following morning. I did not write up that the Alpha had been in the corridor because I could not think of a way to do so that would not result in administrative consequences I preferred to avoid. After that, he stayed in the pen. The gap in the outer door frame where I had been sliding the spare cup, I left. It was too small for him to fit through. It was the right size for a cup. I do not know when the others started bringing me things. It was gradual, the way all of this was gradual. Over the 4th and 5th weeks, I began to notice small objects near the gap at the base of the outer door frame when I arrived for my shifts. A bolt, from somewhere in the facility, old and corroded, not one of mine. A piece of closed-cell insulation foam, chewed at one corner. A length of cable sleeve, frayed at both ends. A rat, which was presented through the great gap with some ceremony, and which I declined by leaving it untouched, after which it was retrieved and the matter was not raised again. I did not decline the other objects. The bolt and the foam and the cable sleeve I kept in the left pocket of my tool bag, alongside the spare cup. My daughter later found the bolt and the foam when she was helping me clean the bag out at home and asked what they were. I told her they were from a job. She put them back where she found them without asking further, which is one of the things I appreciate about her. By the end of my 2nd month, the Alpha was sleeping across the access panel cover during my repair sessions. This meant that I was working in a crawlspace directly beneath somewhere between 600 and 800 pounds of large carnivore, and I want to note that this is not a comfortable condition to work in the narrow mechanical sense. The weight altered the acoustic quality of the metal panel, and made certain torque readings require extra care to distinguish from the flex sound of the panel itself. But I worked around it. The other 6 arranged themselves in the pen near whichever panel I was working from, which meant I always had a sense of their positions without needing to check. I found this useful. I trusted the positions. I did not entirely understand why I trusted the positions, but I had stopped interrogating that particular fact. Some things earn trust before you have finished explaining it to yourself. The incident with the facility inspector in my 3rd month was, I think, the moment Veth Saren began to understand what was happening in Harrow Block, though he did not say anything to me directly for some weeks after. The inspector was a man from the Corrections Authority's regional office who had come to do a routine evaluation of the facility's secure housing protocols. He had been through the upper levels without incident and had arrived at Harrow Block on his schedule. His escort, a facility guard named Drew Voss, had the door to the outer corridor open, and was explaining the access procedure when the inspector apparently decided to open the inner pressure door, the one with the grate, without waiting for the explanation to finish. I was in the access crawlspace under panel 4 at the time, replacing the tertiary drain seal. I heard the pressure door open. I heard the inspector's sharp intake of breath. I heard Drew Voss say, very quietly, "Sir, please do not," and then stop. I slid out from under the panel. The Alpha was standing in the pen, 3 feet from the open grate, watching the inspector. The inspector was standing in the outer corridor, completely still, with the expression of someone who has made a calculation error and is in the process of accepting the results. Drew Voss had his hand on the door handle and was not moving. The other 6 Drevek were positioned behind the Alpha in a loose formation that I had seen before, the listening formation. I had come to call it. Ridge spines elevated, heads low, weight slightly forward, all of them oriented the same direction. When they arranged themselves that way, the pen, which was already not a small space, seemed considerably smaller. I said, "Morning." The Alpha turned his head toward me. He held for a moment, long enough for the inspector to understand that a decision was being made in that fraction of a second, and that the decision was not his to make, and then walked back to the far end of the pen and lay down. The others followed, and the sound of 7 large bodies settling onto the great floor was, in the silence of that corridor, quite significant. The inspector closed the pressure door very carefully and did not complete that section of his evaluation. He asked me, in the corridor, how I had done that. I said I hadn't done anything. He wrote something in his evaluation folder that I never saw. Veth Sarin called me into his office the following afternoon. He asked me how long the animals had been responding to me that way. I said I wasn't sure what way he meant. He said he meant the way in which a pack of apex predators apparently cleared the area of the grate and returned to rest on a verbal cue from a maintenance contractor. I said I thought he was probably reading significance into coincidence, and that the animals had simply been reacting to the door opening, not to me, and that the timing had been coincidental. He looked at me for a long moment. He was not a man who was easily deceived. He had the quality, common to effective deputy wardens, of having seen enough evasion to recognize its outline even when the specific form was new to him. He said, "Right," in the tone of someone who does not believe a word of what they have just heard but has decided that pursuing the matter further is not currently productive. He told me to be careful. I said I would. He let me go. I will tell you what actually happened in that pen, which is simpler than the significance Veth Sarin was trying to find in it. I had spent 3 months in Harrow Block, 6 hours a day, 4 days a week, working quietly in the access crawl spaces and at the panel stations. I had not shouted. I had not made sudden movements. I had not entered the pen ever, though I had the keycard and the physical access. I had kept the water cold, replaced the filters on the correct cycle, fixed the great gap, and accepted a bolt and a piece of foam and a cable sleeve through a gap at the base of the outer door frame. I had called the Alpha Save, which was not a name he understood, but was a sound he had apparently associated with my presence, because he turned his head when I said it. I had done all of this consistently, without variation, without drama, for 3 months. The animals had simply concluded, on the basis of available evidence, that I was not a threat and was possibly useful. This is not a remarkable conclusion. It is what any reasonably calibrated organism concludes about another organism that behaves consistently, maintains the environment, and does not cause harm. It is what I had concluded about them. The fact that I had also concluded, without making a ceremony of it, that Save was one of the most dignified living creatures I had encountered in my 22 years of maintenance work. That he had a quality of presence that most officers in that facility would have traded their rank insignia for, a quality that I can only call, for lack of a better word, steadiness, was my business, and I kept it to myself. The termination notice came on my first day of the 5th month. I was in the middle of Harrow Block's quarterly inspection cycle, which meant I had work planned for the next 2 weeks. The notice was delivered by Drew Voss, who had the expression of a person delivering bad news on behalf of someone who could not be bothered to deliver it themselves. He handed me an envelope. The envelope contained a printed notice on the warden's office letterhead, informing me that my contract was being concluded effective the following Friday, citing a security protocol review by the deputy warden's office and thanking me for my service to the facility. The language was standard. The facility authority used it the way they used most language, efficiently, without warmth, as a container for a decision that had already been made. I read the notice, I folded it, I put it in the outer pocket of my tool bag. I said, "Thanks, Drew." He said, "I'm sorry, Martin." I said there was nothing to be sorry about. I went back to the access panel I had been opening. What I knew, and what Drew Voss knew, and what I suspect the deputy warden's office also knew, but had chosen to characterize differently in their security protocol review, was that the reason for the contract termination was not a security protocol review. The reason was that a new deputy assistant warden, a young officer named Callow Parith, who had arrived 4 weeks earlier from a facility in the Northern District, and who had immediately begun auditing everything he could find an audit form for, had flagged me as a civilian with no combat or security classification, who was moving through the highest security sector of the facility with apparent animal cooperation that was undocumented, uncontrolled, and unexplained. He had written a memo. The memo had gone to Overseer Dallura. The overseer had signed the termination notice without, I gathered, spending a great deal of time on it. I was, as I had always been, maintenance equipment, and when a piece of maintenance equipment creates an administrative anomaly, you remove it and substitute a compliant one. This was a reasonable position, taken purely on administrative grounds, and I had no particular argument with it. I did, however, have 2 more panels in Harrow Block's quarterly cycle that needed attention, and a drain manifold seal that had been showing stress readings for 6 days, and that I was genuinely concerned about, and the secondary climate control line that had developed a minor pressure irregularity that I had logged and not yet had time to investigate. I planned to spend my remaining contract days completing these items. It seemed like the correct thing to do. The trouble, such as it was, began on the Wednesday before my last Friday. Deputy Assistant Warden Callow Parith came to Harrow Block personally. He brought 4 guards, Drew Voss, and 3 others I recognized by face but not name. He arrived at mid-morning, when I was under the drain manifold access panel, on my back in the crawl space, working on the primary seal that had been showing stress readings. Save was lying across the access panel above me, which meant I could feel the weight of him through the panel cover and hear his breathing. The other 6 were distributed in the pen in the arrangement I had come to know, 2 near the inner exercise door, 2 at the far wall, 1 at the ventilation corner, the youngest of them somewhere above me, judging by the specific lighter sound of her paws on the grate. I heard Parith's voice in the corridor. He had a voice shaped by authority that had not yet been fully tested, clear, precise, slightly forward in the palate, the voice of someone who had been told they were good at this and who was still, on some level, believing it rather than knowing it. He said my name. He said that he was terminating my access effective immediately by direction of the overseer's office, and that I was to gather my tools and exit the sector. I said from under the panel that I was aware of the contract termination date, and that I had 2 remaining days on contract, and that I was currently mid-repair on a primary drain seal that I preferred not to leave in a partial replacement state, because a partial seal was worse than the failing seal I was replacing. He said I was to exit immediately. I said the seal would take another 20 minutes. There was a pause. I imagine Parith had not been told, when he assembled his team and walked down to Harrow Block with his clipboard and his 4 guards, that his opening statement would produce a negotiation conducted through an access panel cover with an occupied Drevak Alpha lying on top of it. I imagined the guards had also not fully briefed themselves on the current arrangement of animals relative to the maintenance stations. Harrow block briefings at Scarath 7 were, I had come to understand, conducted at the sector level rather than the subsector level, which is to say they were conducted by people who had not actually been in the pen corridor recently, and who were working from a general understanding of the area that was accurate in its broad outlines and somewhat thin in its operational details. Pereth told Drew Voss to remove me from the crawlspace. There was a longer pause. Drew Voss is a sensible man. He is the kind of person who came to work in a corrections facility, not because he enjoys the exercise of coercive authority, but because the shift schedule is compatible with family commitments, and the pension is reasonable. He had been watching the situation in Harrow Block for 5 months with the careful attention of someone who intends to still be working at the facility in 5 more years, and who has correctly identified which situations can be navigated by policy and which cannot. He said, "Sir, the access panel is beneath the Alpha." Pereth said he was aware. Drew Voss said, "The Alpha is currently in a resting position on top of the panel cover. If we approach the panel, we will be within." Pereth said he understood the situation and directed Drew Voss to proceed. I heard Drew Voss move toward the panel. I heard him stop. I heard very clearly the sound Save made when he raised his head, the specific low sound, somewhere between an exhale and a vibration, that the ridge spine made when it came up. It was not a growl. It was the sound that comes before a growl, the sound that says the next sound I make will be a growl, and I thought you should know that in advance. It was, in terms of acoustic content, approximately 1 second of information. It contained a very significant amount of that information. Drew Voss stopped. Pereth said to proceed. Drew Voss said, in a voice that was carefully calibrated to be audible to Pereth and to me and to no one else, "Deputy Warden, for the record, the animal's ridge spine is fully elevated and it is oriented toward me." Pereth said he was aware. There was a pause in which I continued replacing the primary drain seal, because I had the old one out and the fitting exposed, and leaving the main drain manifold open was not an option I was willing to accept regardless of what was happening above me. I have opened manifolds in operating conditions that were considerably more distracting than the current one, and I completed those jobs, and I was going to complete this one. The seal was the job. The seal would get done. I was perhaps 4 minutes from finishing when Pereth apparently made a decision. I could tell the moment he made it from inside the crawlspace by the change in the quality of the silence above me. There is a particular silence that follows a decision made by someone who has chosen to act on confidence rather than information, a silence with a slightly pressurized quality, a forward lean in it. His footsteps approached the panel. He was going to handle this himself. He was going to demonstrate to his 4 guards and to the maintenance contractor making things difficult below him that a deputy assistant warden does not negotiate with pipes and animals, and that when he says exit the sector gets exited. I imagine he reached for the edge of the access panel. I cannot tell you exactly what happened in the next 3 seconds from inside the crawlspace, because the access panel above me is not transparent, and because I was finishing the primary seal threading, which required my full attention. What I can tell you is what I heard. The sound Save made when he rose from the panel cover was not loud. It was the sound of somewhere between 600 and 800 pounds of ridge-spine predator moving from a complete rest to a standing position in a fraction of a second, and it produced a displacement of air that I felt through the panel cover as a change in pressure. The sound that followed, the full voice sound, not the warning one, lasted approximately 1.5 seconds and then stopped. In my experience, the version that stops quickly is the more alarming one. An animal that sustains a sound is working through something. An animal that makes one brief, complete, entirely certain sound and then stops has said the thing. and is now waiting to see whether the recipient of that information requires elaboration. Apparently, the recipient required no elaboration. I heard movement, the specific sound of multiple people moving quickly in a confined space, the kind of movement that has no plan behind it except direction. Away. I heard a door. I heard another door. I heard a third sound that I eventually identified as Parith's clipboard hitting the corridor floor, which suggested it had been dropped rather than placed. I finished threading the primary seal fitting. I applied the torque. I held for the full 30 seconds. The seal seated correctly. The manifold pressure gauge, which I could see by tilting my head 20 degrees, read normal. I slid out from under the panel. Save was standing in the open pen space, oriented toward the outer corridor door. His ridged spine was up. His tail was level. He was not in a distressed posture, not pacing, not vocalizing, not showing any of the signs of an animal that has been frightened into action. He had the settled, deliberate quality of someone who has handled a situation and is now confirming that the situation has been handled. The other 6 were behind him and to both sides in a half-circle configuration, facing the same direction, in the listening formation, ridge spines up, heads low, weight slightly forward. They looked like what they were, a very old, very practiced working pack that had done this before and was not particularly alarmed by the need to do it again. The outer corridor door was closed. Through the pressure door's small inspection window I could see, at some distance down the sector corridor, the door to the service anteroom also closed. I could not see anyone in the corridor. I said, "All right." Save looked at me. His ridged spine was still up, but the tail had relaxed by perhaps 20 degrees, which was his version of at ease. I said, "Let me finish packing up." I secured the access panel. I verified the seal torque one more time because it is always worth verifying torque one more time. I checked the manifold pressure gauge a second time. Reading was normal. I packed my tools in their correct places in the tool bag, seal tools on the left, pressure gauges in the center, assorted fittings in the right side pouch, and I zipped the bag and stood up. Save was still facing the door, but he had turned his head to watch me pack. There was something in the watching that I will try to describe accurately. It was the attention of an animal that has made a complex assessment and arrived at a position, and is now observing, with the patience of something that does not need to announce itself, the next thing that will happen. He had been watching me work for 5 months. He knew what packing up looked like. He knew what it meant. I said, "The seal is done. I should go see what I've caused." He turned and looked at me fully. The ridged spine was coming down slowly, the way it came down when whatever the concern was had resolved itself. He walked to the great edge closest to where I was standing. He sat. I put my hand flat against the pressure door's grate, at the height where his head was. He put his nose against the grate, on the other side of my hand. We stayed like that for a moment. The ventilation hum was the only sound in the sector. His breath was warm through the grate mesh. I said, "You've been a good colleague." I picked up my tool bag, went to the outer corridor door, opened it, and went to find out what I had caused. What I had caused was considerable. Parith was in the service anteroom at the end of the sector corridor. 2 of the 3 guards I didn't know by name were also in the service anteroom. Drew Voss was in the corridor outside the anteroom, which I took to mean that the anteroom had reached capacity. Parith had a small laceration on his forearm, a graze, not a bite, the kind of thing that happens when an animal of very large radius moves past you at speed in a confined space, and you don't get entirely clear of the door frame. He had also lost his clipboard, which I had already seen on the corridor floor near the panel area. The 4th guard had apparently decided that the service anteroom was insufficiently distant and was visible at the far end of the sector corridor near the level junction, standing with his back to the wall and his hands visible, which is the posture of someone who has decided that the best strategy is maximum transparency, about their non-threatening intentions. I opened the anteroom door. Pereth looked at me. He had the expression of a person who had presented a very clean administrative solution to a problem and discovered at close range that the problem was not an administrative one. His face was composed, the way the faces of people who consider themselves effective are always composed in the aftermath of events that have not conformed to expectations, composed in the sense of reassembled, not in the sense of settled. I said, I finished the primary seal. He said nothing. I said, the manifold pressure is reading normal. I can include the gauge documentation in my closeout report, which I'll submit by end of shift. He said something. It was not a complete sentence. It had the structure of a question that had gotten stuck partway through its own formation, lost confidence in its own direction, and was waiting to see whether the rest of it materialized. It did not. I said, you have a graze on your forearm. There's a first aid station at the level junction by the elevator. I reached into my inside jacket pocket, where I keep invoices pre-written for every shift. I do this because it saves time at the end of the day, and because I dislike the administrative friction of late invoicing, and handed him the day's invoice. I told him the overseer's office could process it at their convenience. I picked up his clipboard from the corridor floor and handed it to him on my way past, with no particular comment about its presence there. The walk from Harrow Block to the facility's outer yard is 11 minutes on the lower corridor route, 9 minutes on the upper route if you use the second service elevator. I went the lower way because the lower way is quieter, and I wanted a moment without sound, which is what I sometimes need after a shift that has had more variable elements than I prefer. I find that movement in a quiet corridor performs the same function for me that other people apparently get from sitting still. It clears the noise without requiring me to confront it directly, and by the time I reach the far end of something, I have generally arrived at a usable version of what I think about what has happened. What I thought about what had happened was, the seal was done, the manifold pressure was normal, and everything else was administrative consequence that I had not sought and would need to navigate. I had no anxiety about the navigation. I have navigated administrative consequence before. I had gotten about 4 minutes down the lower corridor when I heard the sound behind me. I turned around. All 7 of them were in the corridor. I stood there for a moment and looked at them. The sector gate was 200 feet behind them, open. The pressure door beyond it was also open. Someone had not latched them when they left. I had a reasonable understanding, having seen the speed with which Pereth's team had departed, of why the latching might have been imperfectly executed. Save was at the front of the group. 3 was at the far edge. The others were arranged between them in the corridor in the loose, purposeful configuration I knew, not milling, not spreading, simply there, and oriented the same direction as me. I stood there for a moment longer. I said, you can't come with me. Save sat down in the corridor and looked at me with the expression he used when I said things he considered ornamental rather than operational. I said, I mean it, you absolutely cannot. He sat and looked at me. I looked at all 7 of them standing in the lower corridor in the flat institutional lighting, in the quiet of the deep facility, and I considered my situation with the honesty that the situation required. The facility's main alarm had not sounded. The lower corridor led to the service yard, which connected to the staff vehicle lot. The upper route led back through 3 security checkpoints and approximately 60 people who did not know what was happening yet but would shortly. The lower corridor had, at this hour, no one in it. I said, you're going to walk right behind me. You're going to stay close. You're going to be calm. That is all I'm asking. I turned around and walked. They walked behind me. I want to be precise here, because I think precision matters in an account of something that a number of people have since characterized in ways I find imprecise. They did not mill around. They did not spread across the corridor. They walked in a column behind me in an arrangement that I can only describe as deliberate, save at the front, directly behind me, and the others arranged behind him in a loose formation, the way a unit walks when it is moving through known ground with a clear purpose. Their claws made a soft sound on the corridor floor, a dry, rhythmic, unhurried sound. The youngest step was lighter. The ventilation hum was the loudest thing in the lower corridor. We passed through the lower maintenance access without incident, because there was no one in the lower maintenance access, which is its defining property. We came through into the service yard, which had 2 facility workers in it, a grounds worker near the equipment shed, and an intake-level contractor doing something with a pipe flange near the far wall, both of whom stopped what they were doing and did not start again. We went through the staff vehicle gate, which was open because it is a vehicle gate and vehicles pass through it regularly, and into the staff lot. My transport was in the 3rd row. I put my tool bag in the bed. I turned around. They were standing in the lot in a loose cluster, and several of them were sniffing the administrative sedans in the adjacent row the way dogs sniff objects that have been recently occupied, gathering their information methodically. Save was watching me. I stood at the transport door. I said, "This is where I leave. This is the end of the contract. You go back inside." He looked at me. I said, "I'll," and then stopped, because I had been about to make a promise I could not keep with certainty, and I do not make promises I cannot keep. My daughter has been teaching me this for several years, not by instruction, but by the way she has learned to hold space around my promises, and I have absorbed it. I said, "Go back inside. You'll be all right." He walked to the transport and pressed his nose against the driver's door, at the same height where my shoulder rests when I'm in the seat. He held there for a moment. Then he stepped back. I got in the transport, I started it, I pulled out of the row. In the side mirror, I could see them standing at the lot entry. All 7 with Save at the front. He was watching the transport. I watched him in the mirror until the lot entry went out of frame, and then I watched the road. Overseer Dallara was in the main administration building when I signed out, not behind her desk, but standing near the front corridor, which I took to mean she had been informed of events and had come down to be present for whatever the sign-out produced. She looked at me with an expression that I had not seen in her before. In 5 months, she had looked at me as maintenance equipment, necessary, replaceable, not worth sustained attention. The new expression had something more complex in it, and I think the complexity came from the fact that she was revising a category and was not comfortable with what the revision implied. She said, "The animals returned to the sector voluntarily." I said I was glad to hear that. She said, "Deputy Assistant Warden Parith has been reassigned to an administrative role in the upper facility, pending a review of the unauthorized entry incident." She paused. "He initiated entry to the pen corridor sector without proper protocol." I said that sounded like a reasonable characterization. She looked at me for a long moment. She is a person who has spent most of her career deciding what she thinks about things quickly and then defending the decision. I watched her making an exception to that habit. She said, "I'm going to ask you something and I want a straight answer." I said, "All right." She said, "Did you do any of that on purpose?" I said, "I fixed the drain seal. I fixed the climate filters. I replaced the gaskets on the 6-week cycle instead of the 10-week cycle. That's what I did on purpose. Everything else was the animals deciding something for themselves, and I can't take credit for what someone else decides." She considered that for a long moment. Then she said, "Your invoice will be processed." I signed out and left. My daughter was home when I got in. She is 16, and she is at the specific point in 16 at which she is simultaneously too old to ask how my day was and not quite old enough to have stopped caring about the answer. She asked how my day was. I said fine. She said it didn't look fine. I said it had been a longer day than usual. She asked if something had happened. I said there had been a minor workplace incident that had resolved itself. She asked if I was okay. I said I was fine. She went back to her work at the kitchen table. I put the kettle on and stood at the window for a while. There is something I have been thinking about since that day and have not found the right way to say, and I am going to try to say it here because I think it is the actual point of this account, and not the incident with Perith or the drain seal or the walk down the lower corridor. The Drevek are not what people think they are. Most of what people think they are comes from the fact that they are used in places like Scarath 7 to terrify people, and they are very good at this. And so the record of their contact with people is mostly a record of them terrifying people. This is not who they are. This is a job they were given, which is a different thing entirely, and I say that as a person who has spent 22 years doing jobs he was given. What I know from 5 months of maintenance work in Harrow Block is that they are scrupulously honest about their assessments. They evaluated me for 3 months on the basis of my behavior, my quiet, my consistency, my maintenance of their environment, my willingness to spend 4 hours in a crawl space replacing gaskets without making anyone's life more difficult than it already was. They evaluated me without classification documents or authority credentials or the kind of institutional framing that human organizations use to tell each other who to trust. They looked at what I did consistently over time, and they made a decision, and they did not revisit it. And when someone tried to override that decision with a clipboard and a security protocol review, they were briefly and comprehensively clear about their position. I find this more than I can say about most of the administrative structures I have worked within. Save was a fair judge. He had access to the same information everyone else had, the same block, the same months, the same behavior on record, and he made the correct call. The administration of Scarath 7 looked at me for 5 months and saw a maintenance contractor. The Drevek looked at me for 3 months and saw something else. I am not entirely certain what they saw. I don't think it was anything remarkable. I think they saw someone who showed up, did what he said he would do, kept the water cold, and did not make the mistake of deciding in advance what the thing in front of you is before you have watched it long enough to know. Which is also, I suppose, what I did with them. The contract posted again 8 weeks later, with a 15% increase in the daily rate. The posting noted experience with alien habitat environmental systems as a preference and referenced Scarath 7 directly as the placement. I looked at the posting for a while. The drain work was ongoing. The chemical protocol on the cleaning solution had not been corrected, which meant the gasket replacement cycle would resume at the same pace. The ventilation filters would need attention again in 6 weeks. There was no one else on the posting board with my certifications who had worked that facility before. I signed it. My daughter asked why I was going back to the same facility. I said the drain work was ongoing, and it made more sense to have continuity on a long-term maintenance relationship than to hand it off to someone starting fresh. She said that didn't sound like the whole reason. I said it was the professional reason. She said what was the other reason. I said there were some things at the facility I had been maintaining for 5 months, and I wanted to make sure they were in good order. She looked at me the way 16-year-olds look at you when they are deciding whether to push further or let it go. She let it go. When I arrived at Harrow Block on the first morning of the new contract, the lower corridor was quiet. I keyed through the sector gate, went to my equipment closet, opened my tool bag on the bench, and reviewed my inspection list. The drain manifold had 3 items flagged in the handover notes. The ventilation scrubber was past its service cycle. The climate seal gaskets on the inner pen wall had not been touched in the 8 weeks I had been away. I picked up my tool bag. I walked down the corridor to the pressure door. He was at the grate when I got there. He had been there for a while, I think. There was the familiar sound of his breathing through the gap in the door frame, slow and even and entirely unhurried. The breathing of an animal that had been waiting with no particular urgency, because it was not uncertain about what was coming. I said, "Morning save." He pushed his nose through the door frame gap on the other side of my hand. I held there for a moment the way I had held the first time, his breath warm through the metal, his amber eyes at my height, no urgency from either side. The ventilation scrubber behind the inner wall was running at the wrong frequency again. I could tell from the pitch, which meant it was already past its service interval, and someone had been letting it drift. The climate seal gaskets on the inner wall had not been touched. The drain manifold had 3 flagged items. There was a full shift's work here and more behind it, and the chemical protocol on the cleaning solution still had not been corrected and probably would not be corrected. And in 6 weeks the gaskets I put in today would be showing stress. I said, "All right, let me get to work." I opened the access panel and got to work.